Depending on who you ask, Earth has anywhere between 5 and 7 distinct continents, all of them having unique geographies, climates, and ecosystems, with some of them being so different from each other that it's hard to believe that they're on the same planet. But what if I told you that in the distant past, there was a world where only one massive continent existed? As it turns out, the continents are moving, and this has drastic implications for Earth's geography and climate over large time scales. It's what we call plate tectonics. Now, before we get into moving rocks, I'd appreciate you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell to stay tuned for future content. Okay, so in order to understand why there was only one continent in the past, we need to understand why continents move in the first place. You see, Earth is made up of several layers, from the crust all the way down to the inner core. I covered most of them in greater detail in an earlier video, but for this topic, only the top two layers, the crust and the mantle, are relevant. The crust is a thin layer of solid rock that extends just a few miles or kilometers below the surface in most cases. This sits atop the mantle, which is a significantly thicker layer of liquid rock. Over extremely long timescales, the rocks in the mantle move around, and this moves the crust above it. The crust itself isn't one giant continuous shell around the planet. Instead, it's broken into gigantic pieces known as plates. These plates get carried along with the mantle's movement, and since the plates themselves largely line up with continents and oceans, the end result is that the continents and oceans move over time. However, this movement happens incredibly slowly on human time scales, with most continents moving only a couple inches per year on average. This movement adds up over incredibly long time scales, like on the order of tens of millions of years. Over time spans like these, the continents might take on completely different positions, which can end up making the world map borderline unrecognizable. So, how can the continents all become one huge continent? Well, all you need is for the plates containing the continents to join together and make one big landmass. This is what's known as a supercontinent, and it's happened several times throughout Earth's history. Some of the most notable include Rodinia, which existed approximately a billion years ago, Pangaea, which existed about 550 million years ago, and Pangaea, which existed about 250 million years ago. Of the three, Pangaea is by far the most well known, since it was the most recent and the shapes of our modern day continents are mostly derived from it. In fact, the idea that Pangaea once existed, and by extension, the theory of plate tectonics as a whole, was hypothesized in part because parts of some continents, most notably Eastern South America and Western Africa, look like they fit together as if they were pieces of a puzzle. You might think that a few hundred million years seems a little too short for such massive land masses to form. After all, in order for a supercontinent to exist, literally all of Earth's continents need to be joined together. The reason for this is simple. The continents are huge, and Earth is not that huge. Simply put, when a supercontinent breaks up and the continents start moving away from each other, it's only a couple hundred million years before they're as far apart as they can possibly be from each other. And after that, they start moving closer and closer together until they all find each other connected once again. This process is still happening today, and it's projected that in about 200 million years, the continents will once again come together and form a new Pangaea. It's worth mentioning that it doesn't necessarily take huge shifts in the positions of the continents to drastically influence the planet as a whole. For instance, after barely being separated for tens of millions of years, North and South America were joined at the Isthmus of Panama about 3 million years ago, and this joining is believed to have kickstarted the last ice age. One final note. Just because all of the continents are technically connected, it doesn't mean you have a supercontinent on your hands. If that was the case, we would have had a supercontinent as recently as 10,000 years ago, when lower sea levels as a result of the last ice age joined the Americas with Asia, which resulted in all the continents save for Australia being connected by land, despite the actual continental plates of, say, South America and Asia being on opposite sides of the globe. Okay, but what is Earth like when all the continents are connected? Well, it's safe to say that the world would be a very different place from the one we live in now. For instance, it's in order for all the continents to connect to begin with, they need to crash into each other somehow, and the process of continents colliding more often than not results in a huge mountain range where they meet, since tons of rock is forced upward during the collision. The most infamous example of this today is the Himalayas, which formed when the Indian subcontinent rammed into the greater Eurasian landmass about 20 million years ago. This happens multiple times as continents come together to make a supercontinent, and the end result is some extremely mountainous geography as a whole. In fact, it's believed that the modern-day Appalachian Mountains, as well as some low-lying mountains in Europe and Africa, are the remnants of an enormous mountain range that once existed in Pangaea. There's also the fact that continents in general have a huge influence on the global climate as a whole, thanks to their roles in disrupting the ocean currents and wind patterns that influence it, and these effects are amplified in a supercontinent. One way that this can happen is that a supercontinent may have an extremely wet climate around its edges and a huge desert in its interior. This could happen because moisture tends to have a really, really hard time making it far from the ocean. We can see this happen today in central Eurasia, which is in some parts over 1,500 miles or 2,400 kilometers from the nearest ocean. This region of Asia is a vast desert, with the only semi reliable source of moisture coming from the Mediterranean Sea far to the west, and even that only happens sporadically and during certain times of year. Something just as severe, if not worse, is likely to happen on a supercontinent, especially given the mountainous geography it might have closer to its edges. Something else that can happen is when supercontinents are around is the mixing of pretty much every major ecosystem on the planet. Here's what I mean by that. If you take a landmass with the same species of plants and animals on it and split it in two, then over the course of millions of years, the species on the two landmasses are going to look extremely different from each other. This happens because of evolution and natural selection, as what traits are good enough to survive and reproduce will differ based on the environment and climate of the landmass. We can see this in places like Madagascar, which has been separated from mainland Africa for so long, over 90% of the species that exist there exist nowhere else on Earth. When the two landmasses come back together, these very different sets of plants and animals will compete against each other for survival, with the winner being whoever is able to adapt to this new environment the fastest. This process will happen on a global scale as a supercontinent forms, with the end result being species on one end of the supercontinent being not terribly different from species on the other end, even if they're thousands of miles away from each other. Overall, supercontinent Earth looks very different from seven continent Earth, with everything from geography to biodiversity being impacted. Would humans actually do well in this environment? We only need to wait 200 million years to find out. And that's all I have to say about huge continents. As always, I'd appreciate you to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell to stay tuned for future content. Thanks and have a great day.